Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeterswansociety, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the story of people, partnerships, and action for continental conservation. I know this is new information for me, and I'm assuming that it'll probably be new information for you, and I think you're in for a real treat. With us today, besides our speaker, Mike Anderson, we have some of our board people, Jim Hawkins from the Yukon, Marianne Coughlin, who will be asking the questions that you put in the Q&A box, Lisa LaFranco, Tiffany Mayo, and Jeff Nelson. But before we get to Jeff talking a little bit about our programs, I'd just like to let you know that you are muted and your video is turned off. This webinar is being recorded and you'll receive the link in 2 days. I'll send you the YouTube link. And we do ask that your questions be put in the Q&A box at the bottom. So Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about what Trumpeter Swan Society does?
Sure. Thanks, Margaret. First, thanks to everyone for taking the time to get on the webinar today. I think it's going to be a really interesting review of the last 25, 30 years that's gone on with regard to planning and trying to do something for North America's waterfowl. The Trumpeter Swan Society has been around since 1968, so quite a long time now. We're a very effective but pretty small organization, really focused on trying to restore trumpeter swans back to their historical range. We do a whole variety of things. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details, but we have a very active board. We have a conservation committee on that board, as well as a education and communications committee. We do things like review plans that have an impact on trumpeter swans to make sure we do the most we can for trumpeters. We do some funding of some small projects, whether they're research or on the ground habitat projects. We sometimes get involved with sign-on letters. We do advocacy through those means, and sometimes have our members get involved with some of those. We have Trumpeter Watch. We have a variety of things. We're concerned about lead poisoning and power line strikes, so we sometimes get involved with issues around those things. So today's webinar is really important because the North American Plan has provided and continues to provide really the habitat that many, many birds, including trumpeters, rely on. And Dr. Mike Anderson has been on our board for a number of years, along with many people on our board have been involved with the North American Plan over time, including way back to when it first started. And you'll hear about some of those in Mike's talk. Mike and I go back to the late 1970s and at the Waterfowl station, the Delta Waterfowl Research Station, which is on the shore of Lake Manitoba. We were both graduate students, so we've known each other for quite some time. And Mike's been involved with a lot of aspects of the North American Plan. He's whether it's the research side or being involved with some of the planning that's gone on over the years. He's actually writing a book right now outlining all the things that went on as the plan came into being and as it's been implemented over the years. So stay tuned for that. That should be coming out, and it should be a monumental work that really outlines all the work that went into making the plan reality. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Mike Anderson. He's going to give us an outline of the North American Plan history. Mike?
Thanks, Jeff. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Well, welcome. Appreciate you taking the time to tune in. As Jeff mentioned, I do want to give you an overview of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. It's been around for almost 40 years and thankfully became a model for organizing continental conservation that has worked. And it's a story that I think everybody interested in conservation should know something about. The plan, okay, I'm not advancing for some reason. There it is. Okay, so I'll touch on what it is, how it began, how it's evolved over time, and then finally something about how it connects to trumpeters. One of the really interesting things about the plan is it has adapted again and again over that span of 40 years to changing knowledge, and both social and ecological knowledge, and that's been very helpful. The beginnings, though, we go back to the early 1980s, and there was pretty rampant habitat loss occurring throughout the mid-continent breeding areas of Canada and the U.S. There was also it was also getting dry for a series of years in the 1980s. We saw really nasty erosion of soils in those days, reminiscent of what we saw in the 1930s. There wasn't a lot of conservation tillage being practiced. A lot of fields were left bare through the winter, and without moisture, they blew, and things were really quite bleak in the U.S. Midwest and Western Canada during those days. People studying ducks at that time also discovered some pretty distressing things. Mallards, which are one of the most common ducks in North Dakota, in some of the best habitat, were not producing enough young annually to sustain the population. They were losing ground. Folks like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service tried some pretty drastic things, like fencing plots of good nesting cover, the grass, and electrifying the fences to try to keep predators out and make up for poor production out in the broader landscape. But that wasn't a very practical thing to do at a large scale. There was also a lot of contention at that time about the effects of hunting on duck populations. More conservative Canadian biologists generally were concerned that we might be over-harvesting certain species. There were differences of opinion north and south in the U.S. flyways too, and just general concern about how we might be affecting populations through hunting. And a lot of time was being spent trying to figure that out and argue our way sort of through it. Thankfully, well, let me just back up and show you where we were in terms of populations at that point. This is a graph of breeding population estimates for the mid-continent and beyond of in this case total breeding ducks. Those surveys done by air and ground by federal pilots from the Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Wildlife Service began in the mid-50s, and you show pretty high populations here at that time. It got dry in the 60s, the population declined. It was wetter back in the 70s, and they recovered. But then starting about 1980, steady trickle downward. And that downward trend, coupled with the habitat conditions we were seeing, alarmed people. Fortunately, there were a few folks like Dr. Jim Patterson, who was about to become the director of migratory birds for Canada, who said, there's got to be a better way. We're spending all our time arguing over hunting regulations. The habitat is declining, and we really haven't done anything significant about the habitat. We gotta get organized. And so, along with support from the U.S., people like Harvey Nelson, the Fish and Wildlife Service, set about developing national waterfowl plans for the two countries, with the notion that eventually they get to the point where they try to do something internationally. The plans had a lot of similarity in that they both concluded the need for habitat conservation was the most important thing, but there were differences too. Again, in the U.S., there was a lot more interest in things like the distribution of birds in the winter for equitable harvest opportunities, things like that. But come together they did, and the federal government struck a negotiating team in 1984 to try to put together a common plan. Here's Patterson again on the left. The U.S. co-chair was this gentleman, Dr. Raleigh Sparrow, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And these people did a lot of really good work in about 18 months to help move the plan to reality. All middle-aged guys. I'm happy to report that today, if you were to take a similar picture of the leadership of the North American plan, it would be much more gender diverse than it was 40 years ago. But I made progress. The plan was released for consultation in '85 and finished in '86. It included continental objectives for duck populations and a call to action. But the major challenge was to plan and deliver an unprecedented habitat restoration program. Their ambition was large. They said, whoops, what happened here? They said that they needed $1 billion to conserve 5.5 million acres over 15 years. That's a huge leap over most any other habitat restoration plans that have been put together in North America. And to do that, they started off with a budget of nothing, not a dime. So the challenge was considerable. The plan was signed as a strategy for cooperation, not a blueprint, not a really detailed game plan. Neither country was ready to put money on the table, but they said, look, this is what we need to accomplish, and here's how we think we can do this. A couple of really important things that happened. One was that they recognized that no one agency could lead this, could do this. No one had the authority to work in all these states, in both countries, and command the resources needed to do this. Nor did they have the knowledge of what to do in each of these regions that were considered to be, they identified these half dozen areas as the most important places for waterfowl to begin the work. So they created these regional grassroots self-formed partnerships of public and private organizations and individuals to develop the plans and deliver the stewardship at a regional level, pooling skills and resources, but united in the common cause to achieve the goals of the plan. Some of the lessons from NAWMP are clear, but one of the big ones is it was built on voluntary partnerships, people working together from Canada to Mexico. Mexico came a little later, to achieve really big things when nobody was in charge, which is a really unique model and one that hadn't been tried at this scale before. Raising money in this environment was tough. We were at the peak of the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union were busy trying to out-missile each other, and the US was sailing deep into debt to fund mostly the Defense Department, but other things as well. Not an auspicious time to go looking for money to conserve ducks and wetlands. However, fortunately, some people did. Some states and NGOs stepped up to lead. Among them, people like Gary Myers from Tennessee. We had Bob Davison, who was a staffer for Senator Mitchell from Maine. We had Hazard Campbell, a senior volunteer for DU. There were multiple people who said, we got to figure out how to do this. And so they put together a plan called the at the time, North American Waterfowl Conservation Act. But folks like Davison, like Larry Yon with the Wildlife Management Institute, said, we need broader support. We need to think more broadly about this. This needs to be about wetland conservation more than about waterfowl conservation. So it was renamed the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, and it passed with huge majorities in both houses of Congress. It set up a competitive grant program for wetland conservation, not only in the U.S., but in Canada and Mexico too, because of the interest in migratory birds. See, the waterfowl were still partly driving this. So it was a continental funding program, but it required matching funding from non-federal U.S. sources. Brilliant, because that meant you had to leverage partners like the states, non-government organizations, individuals had an incentive to help leverage the money coming from the federal government. It was managed by a new quasi-independent council appointed by the Secretary of the Interior in the U.S. and a parallel council in Canada. What did it do? Well, leaping ahead to 2024 and about 35 years of work, it accomplished a lot. Remember, they were dreaming about maybe $1 billion over 15 years, and what came to pass was about $1.5 billion federal dollars, 6,200 partners leveraging another $3.6 billion. So U.S. matching funds greatly exceeding federal funds, which made it attractive to Congress, of course. And in Canada, another $1.5 billion from the U.S. matched by $1.8 billion from Canadian sources, and some work in Mexico too. So pretty substantial accomplishments. But one of the things that happened is that these original 6 joint ventures that were recommended in 1986, rather quickly by the mid-90s, had exploded to wall-to-wall joint ventures across the U.S. and big areas in Canada and Mexico. Well, why'd that happen? Well, people saw the opportunity for some funding. Secondly, many of the other bird groups saw the North American model as something they wanted to emulate. And so these joint ventures became not just waterfowl joint ventures, but all bird joint ventures. That created some angst, I will say, among the waterfowl people who were concerned about the dilution of the effort on waterfowl. But it turned out that in the long term, so much more good happened as a result of all these groups coming together that it made a lot of sense. Some of the groups that, again, were spawned after the coming of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the Waterbird Conservation Plan. Partners in Flight was a hemispheric plan for migratory land birds. Fish habitat plan, shorebird habitat plan. Heck, there's even a monarch butterfly joint venture now. So the North American Waterfowl Plan has been a model that's been widely emulated by others in the development of conservation work across the continent. Okay, back up to the mid-1980s again. Another important thing that happened was the 1985 Farm Bill, which, among other things, incentivized farmers in the prairie pothole country and other places to seed down marginal land to permanent cover, to permanent grass cover, and take it out of production. That should have been really helpful for upland nesting waterfowl and many other wildlife species, but it remained dry. Thankfully, starting in about 1993, parts of North Dakota started to look like this. It got wet, and it stayed wet for a number of years. So what happened with that new grass on the land and the new water? What you would expect to happen was an improvement. I showed you this graph before. The little blue horizontal line here was the average duck populations through the 1970s, which had been chosen as the objective for the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. What happened is that after this dip, cover returned to the land, water continued to return to the land, and populations grew. It got a little drier for a while in the early noughts, and then it improved again. So it looked like things were really working quite well. Well, subsequently, the populations have dropped somewhat again. A lot of the Conservation Reserve Program land went back into production in the ethanol craze about 15 years ago, and it got drier again. But still, you see, we're in a position where we're still around the goal level for the North American plan and way above where we were back in 1989. Let's look at all birds. For some time now, both Canada and the US, about every 5 years, have taken a look at the status of bird populations with a different set of data, breeding bird survey data, that date back to about 1970. And if you look at all these different groups of birds, the group that has done the very best has been waterfowl. Now, it's a little misleading because there's some very abundant goose populations here and some sea duck populations that are not doing as well. But overall, waterfowl are doing well. So are raptors with the elimination of a lot of persistent pesticides. Water birds doing fairly well, probably on the coattails of the same work that was done to help enhance waterfowl. Unfortunately, grassland birds in particular are under considerable stress, and others in between. I want to turn now to the process of sort of learning and adapting and staying relevant. One of the important provisions of the initial plan was that every 5 years they would step back and review where they were going, what progress was being made, and how circumstances were changing, and what adaptations the plan should consider. The first update was in 1994, next one in 1998, and what those did is summarized here. In 1994, two things happened. One was, with all the planning since 1986 on what the joint ventures needed to do, and now this is planning not by a committee sitting around a table and just kind of brainstorming, but by people in the regions thinking hard about what it was going to take to do the job of habitat conservation in their area. And so that meant that when you summed up all those new plans, it was going to take a lot more work than people initially thought back in 1986. So it focused on a much bigger job ahead. And happily, Mexico was ready to join at that point, and they became a full partner in the plan in 1994. In 1998, in response to this proliferation of interest by other birds, the plan partners went through a difficult process of thinking about whether they should dissolve the plan and just become an all-bird plan, or whether they should be the sort of the keepers of the vision for waterfowl and develop new ways of working in partnership with the other bird plans. That's where they landed. And recognizing that this had to be more than just, patchwork projects, but conserving whole landscapes for all birds and other values. The next update in 2004 focused on biological foundations. What I mean by that is, the population seemed to be responding, but we weren't very clear-minded about exactly which projects in which places had what effect on the birds. We were still, using the best information we had and drawing on it, but making assumptions, and really felt like if we were going to improve return on investment, we needed to better understand the effect of what we were doing on the birds. And so we went through a period of, about 5 years of taking stock with a bunch of different groups formed to pursue certain elements of biology to help understand where we should be focusing our effort. At the end of that time, it became pretty clear that the North American plan really needed to reconsider some of its basic properties. And so a period of a couple of years went by with extensive consultations led by this guy, Jim Ringelman, throughout Canada and the US, asking partners what they thought we should be doing, what our fundamental goals should be, and what changes we might need to make. One of the things we heard and learned that there'd been a steady decline in waterfowl hunter numbers leading up to that 2011 period. Trends similar in Canada, just doesn't show much compared to the scale of the US change. But more than that, surveys and research show that North Americans are becoming less connected to the land, more urbanized, less connected to wildlife. Hunting traditions were part of it, but it was more than that. A startling thing to realize was that only 25 years after the initial founding of the North American Plan, there were 65% more people on the globe than there were then. And when you think about the impact that people have globally, it became pretty clear that we really needed to consider people more explicitly in our plans. Whether it's affecting climate and air or arable land or water, people are just have to be recognized as an important part of the equation. So the 2012 revision of the plan had two objectives that were very similar to what we began with in 1986. Abundant and resilient waterfowl populations, wetlands and other habitats sufficient to sustain them, while providing also places for people to recreate and important ecological services that benefit society. But we added a growing number of people who enjoy and actively support waterfowl and wetland conservation, trying to move more and more of those people into the supporter category. So it turns out now, instead of just trying to manage a biological system, managing habitat for birds, there's a need to understand much better the values, desires, and attitudes of a wide array of stakeholders. We would be operating in a multi-objective environment. This would bring new monitoring, assessment, and adaptation challenges to the partnership, trying to figure out how people could be more supportive of the work that we were doing. Just briefly, the next update in 2018 renewed most of those recommendations from 2012, but it added one thing, an education plan. And there was evidence that the number of people being trained in wetland and waterfowl ecology was declining in Canada and the US. Fewer places where students could go to get that kind of education. And so the question is, well, who will staff these organizations in the future? Who will be developing the information needed to help guide conservation? And so there's a new initiative just coming together to help promote more of these opportunities at universities. And the last update, 2024, involved, again, trying to expand our footprint on the land, more habitat, better tracking of habitat trends, more partners, as a major focus in trying to enhance and grow the impact of the plan to help make sure that these populations are sustained for the long term. And still a lot of debate about how to best integrate people goals in the plan and in the work that that the joint ventures are doing. Well, to sum up, I mean, why has the plan been successful? I think there are a handful of things, and they're worth noting as a way of informing other groups and other interests that might be wanting to do something similar. We were fortunate to build on a 70-year foundation of international cooperation between Canada and the US, and for a shorter time with Mexico. That goes back to the Migratory Bird Treaty of 1916, exactly 70 years before North American Plan was signed. It was born in a crisis of concerns about shrinking populations, declining habitat, and uncertainty about effects of hunting. We were fortunate to have founding leaders with vision and determination to do something better. They settled on simple, compelling objectives. Population levels of the 1970s were a stretch from the mid-80s, but they didn't seem impossible. They didn't seem like, turning a clock back to the 1950s was feasible, but the 1970s were chosen. The idea of public-private partnerships and shared responsibility to plan and deliver and fund the work was novel and absolutely critical to the thing working. And then, as I've mentioned before, this commitment to managing adaptively and to regularly renew the plan at roughly sort of 5-year intervals. But culture mattered too. It was really the people who cared about the resources and what they needed, the habitat, who lit the fire. Partners cared about outcomes, not necessarily credit. Mutual trust in working together was essential to achieve things at large scales. Trust only comes through individual integrity. Sounds like kind of an old-fashioned value these days, but it mattered, and it mattered decisively. Hunters were important at the beginning because they brought a shared passion to the plan. But NAWMPs found creativity and strength in a broad diversity of people, different perspectives, geographies, cultures. Canada and the U.S. have learned from some of the focus on local people that Mexico has always had in its development of conservation work. Partnerships were vital, but so were leaders. There were a handful of people with a fire in their belly, and they would not let a good idea die. People like Gary Myers from Tennessee is a classic example. But the coalition managed, with those attitudes, to foster this notion of, we need to make this work. We're not sure exactly what we need to do. We're not exactly sure how, but we can figure this out. We can do this. And that mattered a great deal. Okay, turning briefly to swans. Trumpeter swans, I think, are a powerful symbol of hope and renewal. And as the North American plan reaches out to new supporters, I think the swans can be an extremely helpful, say, symbol of hope and a recognition of things that can be accomplished by people working together, and we can use that more effectively, I think, than we have to date. Margaret Smith has long said she thinks swans can be ambassadors for wetland conservation, and I completely agree. But along with clean water, biodiversity, flood control, carbon capture, and more, it's more than ducks. It's more than birds. It's all these other things. And again, because swans live their whole lives in wetlands, completely reliant on wetlands, and are charismatic, attractive birds, I think they can help be these ambassadors. I think we should help the joint ventures do more for swan conservation. They have not historically spent a lot of time and energy building swan habitat into their plans. It's happened more on the fringes of birds taking advantage of the things that joint ventures are doing. But the swans are pioneering now into much of the most important duck breeding habitat in the mid-continent. And so the opportunity to hook these together is greater than it's ever been. That's the good news. The challenging news is that political environments have changed, particularly in the U.S. Harvey Nelson, who was the first director of the North American Plan, said this in the first NAWMP newsletter in 1988. By the way, Harvey was also one of the founding directors of the Trumpeterswansociety long ago, and Harvey had a deep personal commitment to trumpeter swans, as well as to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. In fact, Harvey Nelson was at a trumpeter swan meeting in Minnesota, still working for the birds, the day before he died. Anyway, we're currently dealing with deep uncertainty as the U.S. has retreated from conservation and science. Federal retrenchments, including stopping NAWCA, North American Wetland Conservation Act funding for Canada and Mexico. I hope and expect it will return someday, but right now, the Department of Interior has frozen it. It is, despite being passed by Congress, it's not flowing, and there's no indication that it will anytime soon. Science support was very much in jeopardy in the big, beautiful bill. Banding office, breeding bird survey, co-op units, the science centers, surveys. Fortunately, kind of at the 11th hour, much of that was retained with cuts, but the programs weren't completely axed. But we've seen key people in the system retiring early. We see continuing threats to public lands, policy changes, including just yesterday, indications of changes to the Endangered Species Act and to wetland protection in the U.S. So times are tough. I'm an optimist. I think we can survive this, and that eventually things will turn around. There's been, with NAWCA, for example, the Wetlands Act, there's been incredible bipartisan support in Congress, both houses, to support that work. At the very end of 2024, it was reauthorized with overwhelming bipartisan support. I hope and think that can be resurrected in time, but there has to be some improvement in how the administration and Congress are working together before that's going to happen. So sorry to include that little downer as we close, but that's a reality today. North American Plan is approaching 40 years of age, an unprecedented long time for a conservation plan, and its impact on North America has been remarkable. It's our job to keep it alive. And with that, I'm done and would be happy to answer any questions that folks might have, or just continue the dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mike. So this is Margaret again. So if you have questions, do put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and Marianne will let us know as those are coming in. But Mike, I think it was great what you talked about with the importance of the people. You know, people are part of the problem, but people can also be the solution, whether it's the commitments made through NAWMP or the North American Wetland Conservation Act, you know, NAWCA, through the joint ventures and that kind of thing. So really, it's people who make a difference. And for the cutbacks and things that are going on as well, you know, you as individuals can work with your representatives, whether it's in Canada or the US, to say what values are important to you in terms of what you want to have supported. So you have a voice. The NAWMP plan recognizes that you as an individual are important as well, whether you're a birder, just a person on the street, you know, a angler or hunter, conservationist, whatever it is, you matter. And so I think that that's really an important lesson to take. So Marianne, have any questions come in? Is she on mute?
You're muted, Marianne.
My apologies. We do have several questions, and I see more coming in. Please continue to add your questions as we go through. The first question, Mike, is the steep decline in grassland birds continuing, and which species are most involved?
It has. Those data were as of 2024, and the pattern for the U.S. trends are similar. It's birds, it's species mostly from the mid-continent, and including ones that winter in Mexico or winter in the southern U.S. The fortunate thing, and it's one of these things that is not moving rapidly yet because of no commitments from federal funding. But there is a grasslands initiative, something called JV8, where all the joint ventures in the mid-continent, from Mexico to Canada, are developing joint plans and ideas for conserving or restoring native grasses in that whole region, with an eye on trying to stop the decline of these birds. The components that they're thinking about are things like working with private landowners to reduce overgrazing, to provide perhaps restored wetlands here and there that can help enhance the profitability of grazing, but at the same time, spread out the impact and help the grassland birds. There's also restoration efforts underway here and there, but it's largely the result of just competition for land and the conversion of a lot of former grassland to annual cropping, which is kind of the death knell for a lot of species that aren't going to move into canola, from native grass. But if you want more information, check out Google JV8, and you'll see more about what they're trying to accomplish.
Thanks, Mike. Can you talk briefly about the individual leaders of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan?
Are you thinking about historical leaders or current leaders, or?
That was not specified in the question.
Okay. Well, I'll start off with historical. In the U.S., Harvey Nelson deserves a great deal of the credit for having the vision to organize the various agencies and biologists and get them thinking in big terms about what was needed to conserve the birds. Jim Patterson was his most important parallel in Canada. Patterson was a research biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan at the time this came up, but moved to Ottawa and became the leader of the planning effort there. There were several NGOs involved. Certainly, Ducks Unlimited, Matt Conley in the U.S. and Stu Morrison in Canada were the top people in those organizations at that time, and they got behind this foursquare and helped. But there's several states that were there and ready to contribute too at the beginning, who saw the importance of this, and so in terms of their vision, a guy named Larry Yon, he was a biologist from Wisconsin, ended up going to Washington, where he realized he could have a bigger impact on the land, and became the president of the Wildlife Management Institute. And Larry was a major force in the early days of trying to get the funding together and getting it organized. So, I mean, there were lots and lots of people. There have been literally thousands of people involved in the plan to date. And one of my challenges in the book has been to, give fair coverage to some of those really important leaders, but not neglect the folks who were in the trenches and getting the work done locally too. But it's a long list. It really still is an amazing partnership.
Thank you. How's restoration of beaver activity being viewed in this organization plan?
Um, well, I mean, the I'm not sure I can answer that real effectively because I haven't lately looked at the Eastern Habitat Joint Ventures operational plan, which is Eastern Canada would probably be uh, the area where this is mostly a concern, but the Upper Midwest too. Beavers create habitat. They create wetland habitat, and uh, and so for waterfowl in general, uh, beaver ponds can be very useful habitat. I recognize that they can be destructive too, and cause problems in conflict with human use and human plans for landscapes, and they're certainly not aspen's best friend. But I think there are uh, there were in the early days, back in the early 90s, I guess it was, evaluations of beaver pond management options for enhancing waterfowl in Ontario. So there's been some research done on this, but it hasn't been a big part of the NAWMP program. Um, Really, one of the other things that's happened, I think, evolutionarily, is that we've gone from more and more work, from initially a lot of work on more hands-on kind of intensive programs where you do something on the land, you plant cover, you 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 uh, you set things aside and protect them. More and more emphasis now on working um, with landowners, working on working lands, places where people are still making a living, whether it's through grazing or grain farming or whatever, and looking for win-win solutions where you can restore habitat or just protect habitat um, without necessarily, putting up an electric fence and hoping that the ducks will land inside it.
We also have a comment from an attendee who just wanted to say that they thought this was an excellent program, Mike. So thank you very much. I'm sure they'll be looking for your book as well. And then the next question is, how are conservation of pothole ponds accomplished in light of urban sprawl? Do people work with planning departments of cities that border such areas?
Yeah, there are some examples of that. There's been a lot of effort to try to create wetland policies that that somehow reach a reasonable compromise between development and retention. Um, and there's been pretty good progress in some jurisdictions. It's complicated in Canada because it's done province by province, unlike in the US, where federal policy basically covers wetland protection. In Canada, it's province by province, and so there's a lot of variability from one province to the other in terms of how good those protections are. Um, it's pretty good in some of the maritime provinces. It's kind of in between. In Manitoba, it's very weak in Saskatchewan, where there are a lot of potholes. So it's a work in progress. Um, in terms of retaining wetlands through incentives, that's part of the program as well. So there's a variety of ways in which partners are trying to do that. But it's ex-urban areas where there's big money involved in development is challenging. In Manitoba, where I live, we've had some success with creating wetlands as stormwater retention ponds in some of these urban developments where they actually create acres of wetlands. The trick there is to try to make sure you've naturalized the vegetation around the ponds so that they don't just become Canada goose grazing places where people and geese run into conflict with one another, but rather if you circle these things with native grasses or other vegetation, you can avoid that. So
We still have plenty of questions. So the next one is, does the plan have a vision or goals for the next 50 years to deal with with challenges such as climate change?
Mm. I mean, climate change is recognized as an important risk. The difficulty, and we this was a plank in the 2024 update on which I worked. Um, the difficulty is that there's so much uncertainty around exactly what's going to happen. You know, if you're talking about coastal systems, um, say the Gulf Coast or the Southern Atlantic coast, where sea level rise is ongoing and evident, um, you can look at things that you might do there to protect the land behind the current wetlands and allow for some migration of those salt marshes back inland where there isn't a hard line drawn by development already. Um, for places like the Prairie Pothole region, the predictions are really very inexact. They're kind of all over the place, and so it's hard to know exactly what is going to happen in terms of the moisture regime. It's going to be more variable. We think we know that. Um, it's likely that there's going to be impacts on agriculture. For example, they're growing corn and soybeans now in places in Prairie Canada where they never did before. And so that's a different challenge in terms of a cropping system, a rotation system, from a wildlife point of view. Um, so what can the partners do about something that is, requires global attention? I think we continue to talk about it and raise the issue with policymakers. But in terms of what we can do within our jurisdiction, it's more about trying to learn what these impacts are likely to be and mitigate them as best we can. Um, but the question certainly suggests that it's very important to try to deal with this internationally, and I agree with that. Um, I don't think the North American plan um, can lead that kind of thing, but we can certainly be a supporting voice in raising concerns about the future.
We have two more questions, and both are related to what you just said. The first one is, why is it so difficult for wildlife conservationists, to emphasize the negative impacts of the continuing human population increase?
Um, well, I think some do. I guess is one part of the response. Um, Second thing is that we're really trying to build partners, build a coalition of people in support of doing the work that we feel is necessary to secure the future of these birds. Um, Again, it's partly a matter of positioning. When I just personally, you know, when I decided to focus my career on wetlands and waterfowl and that part of that area of conservation, it was a sober assessment on my part of. I mean, I was in college in the 60s and early 70s, and there was growing concern about Ehrlich's population bomb and all of the initial concerns about the carrying capacity of the planet for humans. I still share all those concerns, but I looked around and decided, okay, Mike, what can I do? How am I positioned to do something positive for the environment through my career? And rightly or wrongly, I judged that crusading against human population growth was not going to be the way I was likely to succeed because of my positioning and so on. So I chose a smaller piece of the puzzle. But the author or the person asking the question makes a really important point. I mean, fundamentally, we have to worry about the carrying capacity of the planet and how people are overwhelming it, whether it's the atmosphere or the food system or water, fresh water supplies. Ultimately, those are really critical things that we either are going to have to come to grips with, or we're going to have to suffer the consequences of overshooting our, the planet's capacity to support us. That's an individual choice, I think, in terms of what you decide to devote your time to dealing with. And so, anyway, that's how I landed where I landed.
Well, our last question is a great last question and opportunity for action for all of the people listening, as Margaret had mentioned. So, this one is: are there any political leaders today that our attendees and listeners might follow that are focused on this topic?
Hmm. I can't say that there's anyone who's really waving the flag for NAWMP, but I think you'll find people with stronger, pretty strong environmental records, voting records, uh, in Congress, um, and certainly those are people you should be paying attention to. Um, we lost a few, unfortunately, in the last few years as folks have retired or have left the scene. But there's people there that that will stand out in terms of their voting records. Uh, in Canada, um, the the current government hasn't shown a lot of interest in focusing on environment lately. They're new. They're concerned with trading relationships and just other relationships with the U.S. They're concerned with building partnerships around the world. They're still kind of pro-development when it comes to oil and gas and other things to try to stimulate the Canadian economy. Um, but I urge you to start with, your local politicians that in your riding, uh, and find out what their record is. Find out, and ask their office. I mean, try to get the information that you need about their voting records as a way of probing. I mean, in our area in Winnipeg right now, we have a guy named Terry Duguid who's been doing all kinds of useful environmental work for 30 years. But they're here and there, and but ferret them out and challenge them. And if you hit a dead end or you don't like what you're hearing, um, look elsewhere. But I think there are some out there. They're just, unfortunately, they kind of mostly have their heads down these days because of the culture of politics in the U.S. right now, and in Canada, we've been so busy responding that it's been hard to responding to what's going on globally that it's been hard for the environment to sort of bubble to the top of the list. But it takes some research, and but it absolutely is worth your time and worth doing because um, those people can have a big influence on where we head in the future.
Thank you. We did have a couple more questions come in as you were giving that answer. And I know we're getting close to the end here. So I'll pick one, and that is, do you have any humorous stories about the plan in the last 40 years? If you could pick one to share.
God, the last 40 years. Um, mm, I'm I remember an incident early on when people were trying to figure out what a joint venture was about, where a friend of mine was going to go on a tour of the marshes south of New Orleans, and so they had a Fish and Wildlife Service boat, but the trailer didn't work. So they called the state, and somebody from the state came along and we loaned them a trailer. They got the boat on a trailer. They were heading out, and they didn't have the full crew. It was a bigger boat. Didn't have a full crew to run it. But somebody knew somebody from the Nature Conservancy, and they called them and said, "Yeah, we got some guys who could run the boat." And they went over there, and then they didn't have any gas, and so some guy from DU who was involved with it goes, "Well, I'll fill it up. We'll fill it up. We'll get out there. We'll do this," and it was a symbol of this whole notion of a partnership. They wanted to try to do something to conserve this coastal wetland project, but nobody had, they weren't really all that well organized. They didn't have, no one group had what they needed to sort of get it done. But here's 4 or 5 groups that came together, launched the boat, went out, got the project done, and that was it's not humorous so much as it is just an interesting anecdote about how things were at the beginning, where people were just trying to figure out how to do this stuff.
That's a great anecdote. Thank you, Mike. And those are all of our questions, Margaret.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Mike. And I want to thank Mike for this great presentation, and our panelists who have been here. And I want to thank you who've been watching and participating in this, for signing up for this webinar and registering for it, and, being willing to learn new stuff. And thank you for attending. As you sign off, there will be a brief survey. I look at that, and then in 2 days, I will send through Zoom the link to the YouTube recording of this. So with that said, thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you again next time.